While almost everyone knows that J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor and that he specialized in something to do with the English language, not as many people know the details of his academic career. How and when did he become a professor? Where did he work? What did he teach? And, most importantly, what was he even like as a professor? In this video, we'll cover all of these questions through the perspective and words of both Tolkien and his former students. J.R.R. Tolkien's academic journey began many years before he ever studied at Oxford, when he was just a young schoolboy. Young Ronald, under the tutelage of his mother Mabel and later his guardian, was introduced to the old stories, the medieval myths, as well as the ancient classics. These, of course, were paired with lessons in both Latin and Greek, which further captured the imagination of the young boy in the matters of history and language. As this video isn't a general biography on Tolkien, to make a very long story short, these two subject matters, meaning history and language, consumed much of the boy's free time. He would go on to learn as many languages as he could, construct his own, alongside their own invented writing systems. From 1900 to 1911, he almost exclusively attended King Edward's School in Birmingham, for which he won a scholarship in 1903 and was able to continue his studies. It was while at King Edward's that Ronald and his friends formed the Tea Club and Barovian Society, or TCBS, during whose meetings they would discuss all things literature. Now, following graduation from King Edward's in 1911, he was accepted into the University of Oxford, and specifically Exeter College, to study the classics before ultimately switching to English language and literature. In the midst of the First World War in 1915, Tolkien was able to graduate while receiving first-class honors. Soon thereafter, in the same year, Tolkien enlisted in the British Army as an officer, and thus his official academic journey was temporarily paused until after the end of the war. In 1918, Tolkien began his work at the Oxford University Press and was specifically tasked with researching the history and etymological origins of Germanic words, starting with the letter W for the Oxford English Dictionary. Although these may be perceived as humble beginnings, Tolkien would already start from the following year to provide private lessons to undergraduates studying at women's colleges at Oxford. Within his first 2 years in the workforce, however, by 1920, Tolkien managed to be appointed an English language reader at the University of Leeds and was in fact the youngest member of the university's staff at just the age of 28. By 1924, he had already been promoted to a full professorship, and finally, in 1925, Tolkien took up the chair of Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford's Pembroke College, which he held until 1945. In that year, Tolkien began work at Oxford's Merton College, where he took up the chair of Merton Professor of English Language and Literature, which he held until his retirement in 1959 at the age of 67. During this monumental career, which spanned over 4 decades, Tolkien would provide legendary lectures on an array of subjects, ranging from the Anglo-Saxons with Beowulf, the monsters and the critics, to his beloved fairy tales with on-fairy stories. Tolkien would go on to provide invaluable commentaries, translations, as well as research regarding the history of Anglo-Saxon England especially, but not entirely, as Tolkien was mentioned as an important contributor with translating the Jerusalem Bible, which was used by many Catholics throughout the English-speaking world. It was these fascinations, as well as the result of his academic work, that enabled him to write The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, entirely during his time as a professor at Oxford. Finally, to top off an extraordinary career, Tolkien, for his contributions to academia, was made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1972, while from his University of Oxford, he received an honorary Doctorate of Letters, the highest degree the university can bestow. Now, having understood his academic journey and career, at least on paper, what do our first-hand sources tell us about Tolkien the professor? What was he like if you were to find yourself in one of his lectures? The answers are many. What most people can agree on is that Tolkien really knew what he was talking about, and that his insight in English and Anglo-Saxon studies was invaluable. Specifically though, what a lot of sources highlight both within and without his biography was that Tolkien was quite unpredictable as a professor, in a memorable way. He absolutely adored pranking his students in a variety of ways, ranging from Anglo-Saxon rants to trying to convince them that leprechauns exist. Out of nowhere, he would shout in Old English, recite Beowulf to absolute perfection, while slamming his book to gain the attention of his audience. A former student of his, J.I.M. Stewart, who would go on to work at Oxford himself, stated that he could turn a lecture room into a mead hall in which he was the bard, and we were the feasting, listening guests. Now, other accounts, such as that of Diana Jones, painted quite a different picture about Tolkien as a professor. Specifically, she would go on to say that Tolkien was a different matter. He was just a kind of eminence, grace, and a legend. You couldn't hear him lecture. He worked at not letting you hear because he wanted to go away and finish writing The Lord of the Rings. So he had the very smallest lecture room. First of all, it was packed out, so he spoke with his back to the audience and mumbling. Unfortunately, he was talking about, meditating on really, what a plot is like and how it mutates into other plots, and this I found so fascinating that I went back the next week, as did one other person. And this meant that he couldn't stop lecturing and still get the money, which apparently in those days you could if no one turned up. It was a dreadful racket, really. He could have given just the one lecture and then been paid for a term if we'd all stayed away. But this other person and I attended diligently week after week, so he was forced to go on meditating about plots mutating, and what I could hear was fascinating, because he was busy with the really large orchestration of the latter part of The Lord of the Rings at the time. But all I retain is a sense of how marvelous the way plots work is. That was all I got out of it, but I kept going in case I might understand a bit more next week, let alone hear a bit more. From this account, we get the idea that Tolkien would go into the class and mumble to himself with his back turned to the class. This, of course, is contradictory to other accounts that praise Tolkien's teaching, and especially one in particular that described Tolkien insisting on giving more lectures than the university required him in order to do justice to his subject. Nonetheless, Diana Jones did find the experience and what Tolkien was teaching to be fascinating. Some sources seem to focus on Tolkien's voice specifically, and how it could sometimes be unintelligible while he was lecturing or reading. So much so that the Inklings would often have his son Christopher read the drafts of The Lord of the Rings instead of him. If I were to take an educated guess, a deciding factor on the matter of Tolkien's lectures may be the extent of the student's ability to understand his speaking, which may alter the experience dramatically, from being described as a bard to a mumbler. The experience of poet W.H. Auden, in contrast, was that Tolkien's recital of Beowulf was so beautiful that it motivated him to study Old English further, famously claiming that Tolkien's voice was like that of Gandalf. The account of Kingsley Amis, however, was very similar to that of Jones, with Kingsley describing Tolkien as incoherent and often inaudible. He spoke unclearly and slurred important words, and then he'd write them on the blackboard but keep standing between them and us, then wipe them off before he turned around. Amis would go on to discuss his dislike of Tolkien's teaching and academic endeavors with fellow student Philip Larkin, who seemed to not only agree, but criticized Tolkien and his lectures of Beowulf even more. In a letter written by Tolkien to Anne Mountfield, Tolkien said that all teaching is exhausting and depressing, and one is seldom comforted by knowing when one has had some effect. I wish I could now tell some of mine, of long ago, how I remember them, and things they said, though I was, only as it appeared, looking out of the window, or giggling at my neighbor. Notably, it was while grading exams that Tolkien was so terribly bored that he inexplicably wrote, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," on a student's blank paper, and from then on, The Hobbit, and by extension The Lord of the Rings, was born. Other times, naturally, Tolkien commented how much he loved what he did, while other times still, he mentioned that perhaps he should have retired earlier, considering the profits of his books. Ultimately, I think the matter of what Tolkien was like as a professor is very subjective. In truth, you have people mostly clinging to the two extremes. He was either incredible and likened to a bard, or unable to be understood and a mumbler, made the extra effort, or wanted to avoid teaching altogether. With these descriptions usually, though not always, aligning with the respective students' interest in the subjects that Tolkien was lecturing about. Moreover, it is always important to keep in mind the context of a person's quote, as well as the time period of their experience. For example, in a career that spanned 40 years, a quote may reflect his teaching towards the end, or beginning, or during a good or bad period of his life, and not the entirety of such a lengthy academic journey. Nonetheless, these are some of the most famous first-hand accounts of Tolkien's teaching, with second-hand accounts largely contributing to reinforce both contrasting opinions. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.